Okay, so have you ever had that feeling where you're really trying to focus? Like maybe you're trying to really get into some work you need to do, or even just lose yourself in a good book or have an actual conversation with someone. And it feels like your brain is just like a web browser with too many tabs open.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a struggle to stay on track these days, right, with our phones and the internet and everything.
Right.
It seems like it's getting harder and harder to be in control of where we put our attention. And that's why we're doing this deep dive today. We're going to be talking about the ideas from this book called Indistractable by Nir Eyal.
Yeah, Indistractable is really interesting. It's actually kind of a follow-up to his earlier book called Hooked. I bet some people listening have read Hooked.
Yeah, definitely.
It was all about how tech companies design their products to basically get us addicted, get us hooked. And it was really popular because it kind of explained the psychology behind it.
Yeah, it was like he was revealing all the secrets behind how these companies like Facebook and Google and all those, how they figure out how to just grab our attention and keep us coming back for more.
It was like he was giving away their playbook, A lot of people called Hooked a cookbook for human behavior because it really broke down all the steps that these companies use to get us hooked.
Yeah. Like it was almost dangerous knowledge in a way.
Yeah. When he wrote Hooked, Eyal actually hoped that companies would use this knowledge to help people build good habits.
Interesting.
Like using those same psychological principles, but for positive things, helping people stick to exercise routines or whatever. But then he started to see that a lot of companies were using these techniques to exploit people, for profit. And he realized that individuals needed a way to fight back against all these tactics that are designed to grab our attention.
Yeah.
So Indistractable is all about that. It's about empowering us, the users, to take back control of our attention. And a lot of really smart people have praised this book. People like Jonathan Haidt.
I love his work.
Yeah, me too. And Mark Manson and Oliver Burkeman and Ryan Holiday. These are all big names in the world of psychology and behavioral science.
Yeah.
And they've all said that this book is incredibly practical and realistic. It gives people real tools to manage their relationship with technology in a healthy way. So the idea of this deep dive is to really get into the meat of this book.
Right.
Not just talk about it broadly, but really extract those key insights and really dig into the stuff that you can actually start using today to improve your focus and be more intentional with your time.
Love it. Let's do it.
All right. So the fundamental argument of Indistractable is that if you want to master your attention, it's not about suddenly going on a digital detox or anything like that. It's not about just trying harder to resist temptations.
Right.
It's about understanding the roots of distraction. And Eyal says there's a framework for becoming indistractable. He breaks it down into 4 key parts. First, you have to understand the real reasons why we get distracted in the first place. Then you have to learn how to manage those internal urges that lead us to distraction. Then you need to proactively make time for the things that actually matter.
He calls that traction, right?
Exactly. So making time for traction. And then finally, you need to find ways to hack back those external triggers, those things in our environment that pull us away from what we're trying to do. And he also talks about using pacts.
Yeah, like making pre-commitments to ourselves.
Exactly. Strategies to prevent distraction before it even starts.
Cool. Okay, so we've got a lot to unpack here. But let's start back with that connection between Hooked and Indistractable. I'm curious about Eyal's journey here. It seems like he kind of pulled back the curtain on these attention-grabbing tactics and then was like, oh no, what have I done? We need to figure out how to protect ourselves from this.
Yeah. It's really fascinating to see how his thinking has evolved over time. Because with Hooked, he really was kind of like a magician revealing his secrets. But his initial hope was that this knowledge would be used for good. He wanted companies, especially companies doing good in the world, to use these insights to help people. But then he saw how these same principles were being used against people in a way.
Right.
To get us addicted to things that weren't really good for us. And that's when he had this aha moment and realized that he needed to empower individuals to become indistractable. It wasn't enough to just understand how the attention economy worked.
Right.
People needed practical strategies to defend themselves against it.
So what exactly is the problem here? What are we really talking about when we talk about distraction?
Yeah, so I think it's important to acknowledge that distraction is not just about, wasting a few minutes here and there scrolling through social media.
Yeah.
It's something much deeper than that. And Eyal really brings this home by sharing a personal story. He talks about this time when he was so absorbed in something on his phone that he completely missed this beautiful moment with his daughter.
Oh, wow.
He was so caught up in something that felt important at the time, but it could have waited. And by the time he looked up, the moment was gone. And this really made him realize the emotional cost of distraction. You know how it can damage our closest relationships? And he also shares this other story from a reader who told him about his 8-year-old daughter, who said that she wished she had the superpower to talk to animals because that way she'd have someone to talk to when her parents were too busy on their computers.
Oh, my gosh. That is so sad, but also so real.
It is, and I think a lot of parents can relate to that. So to help us really grasp this problem of distraction, Eyal introduces these two key concepts: traction and distraction.
Right.
And you can think of it like a line.
Okay.
Traction is anything that pulls you towards what you really value in life.
Mm-hmm.
Making progress on your goals, building meaningful relationships, taking care of yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And then distraction is anything that pulls you away from those things. And these actions, they're not just random, they're often triggered by specific cues.
Right. And those cues can come from inside of us, like that feeling of restlessness or boredom, or from outside of us, like our phones buzzing with notifications.
Exactly. So you've got internal triggers and external triggers.
Yeah.
The internal triggers, those are those feelings and sensations that come from within. Things like hunger, boredom, stress, loneliness.
Mm-hmm.
Those are often uncomfortable sensations that we instinctively want to escape.
And we often do that by reaching for our phone or something.
Right. And then external triggers, those are the cues in our environment that pull us away, things like notifications on our phones, emails popping up, someone interrupting us. And Al says that what makes distraction so powerful today is this trifecta of distraction.
Okay, what's that?
He says it's the abundance of information. We're constantly bombarded with the speed at which information spreads and the fact that our phones make information accessible to us 24/7.
Right. That makes total sense. And it feels like it's getting harder and harder to just focus on one thing.
It is. And the psychologist Herbert A. Simon actually talked about this way back in 1971. He said, the wealth of information means a dearth of something else, a poverty of attention. And that was before smartphones and social media.
Wow.
But his point is still so relevant today. Eyal argues that our ability to pay attention and focus is absolutely essential for creativity, problem-solving, meaningful work.
Right.
And, even building strong relationships because you need to be present with the people you care about. There's actually research that shows that loneliness can be really bad for our health.
Yeah.
Like more dangerous than obesity. And Eyal uses this really interesting analogy to help us understand this problem.
Okay.
He talks about the Greek myth of Tantalus.
Tantalus, wasn't he the guy who was like forever thirsty and hungry but couldn't reach the food and water?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
He was cursed to stand in a pool of water that receded whenever he tried to drink from it, and with fruit hanging just out of reach. But Eyal points out that the real tragedy of Tantalus wasn't just the fact that he couldn't satisfy his desires. It was that he was so focused on what he thought he needed that he was completely blind to the fact that those things wouldn't have truly fulfilled him anyway.
That's interesting.
So Eyal is saying that we're kind of like Tantalus. We get so caught up in these distractions, these things we think we need, checking our phones, constantly scrolling through social media.
Mm-hmm.
But we're missing out on what really matters.
So we're reaching for things that we think will make us happy, but they actually don't.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about the problem of distraction. Now let's get into the solutions. You mentioned that the first step is mastering those internal triggers. So how do we do that? How do we deal with those uncomfortable feelings that lead us to distraction?
So this is where Eyal kind of flips the script on how we usually think about motivation.
Okay.
He argues that all motivation ultimately comes from a desire to escape discomfort. Yeah, think about it. We eat because we feel the discomfort of hunger. We put on a sweater because we feel the discomfort of being cold. And in the same way, when we feel uncomfortable emotions like boredom, stress, loneliness, we often seek out distractions to make those feelings go away.
That's why I check my phone like 100 times a day.
Yeah.
Just trying to avoid feeling uncomfortable.
It could be. And he gives this really interesting example. He talks about this Yale professor named Zoe Chance who teaches a class on the psychology of influence and consumer behavior. So she knows all about how to get people to do things. but she herself became totally hooked on her fitness tracker.
The fitness tracker?
Yeah, which, on the surface seems like a healthy thing.
Right.
But it turned into this huge distraction for her because it was tapping into her need for progress and reward.
How so?
Well, she started doing all these crazy things to get more steps. Like she would be pacing around her house just to hit her daily goal, even when she was trying to have dinner with her family or have a conversation with someone. And she even made these really elaborate spreadsheets to figure out how to maximize the virtual rewards in the app. And it got to the point where she would wake up in the middle of the night and climb like 2,000 stairs just to get more points.
Oh, my God.
So this is a perfect example of how even something that's supposed to be good for us can become a problem if it's feeding into our desire to avoid discomfort.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And Eyal says that the traditional view of motivation is that it's all about pleasure and punishment, the carrot and the stick. But he says it's much more about escaping discomfort. And the important thing to realize here is that distractions are often just the proximate cause.
Okay.
Like we tend to blame the thing itself, the phone, the social media app, whatever.
Yeah.
But the root cause is usually some uncomfortable feeling that we're trying to avoid.
So it's not really the phone's fault, it's my fault.
Kind of.
Yeah.
He says blaming external factors is just a way of avoiding the real issue.
Which is
that we're uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And he has this really powerful phrase, time management is pain management.
Time management is pain management.
Yeah, because distractions cost us time. And we often get distracted because we're trying to avoid some kind of pain. But he also digs into why we're so restless in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Why we always feel this need to be doing something.
Yeah, like why can't I just sit still and relax?
Well, he talks about our evolutionary history.
Yeah.
How boredom might have actually been beneficial for our ancestors because it pushed them to explore and find new things.
Interesting.
But today, boredom can be really uncomfortable. And then he also talks about negativity bias.
Right. Our brains are wired to focus on the negative stuff.
Exactly. And rumination, that tendency to dwell on negative thoughts. And hedonic adaptation, which is the fact that we tend to return to a baseline level of happiness even after good or bad things happen. So basically, we're kind of wired to be restless.
Okay, so that's kind of depressing.
I know. But Eyal also points out that this dissatisfaction is what has driven a lot of human progress.
That's true.
So it's not all bad. But the question is, how do we deal with these uncomfortable feelings without constantly getting distracted?
Right.
So the obvious answer might seem like just using willpower, just trying harder to resist those urges. But Eyal says that can actually backfire.
Really?
Yeah, because when you try to suppress a thought or a feeling, it often just makes it stronger. So instead of trying to fight those urges, he suggests a technique called surfing the urge.
That's surfing the urge.
Yeah. It's about observing those negative sensations with curiosity instead of trying to push them away. Like the writer Oliver Berkman says, it's a curious truth that when you gently pay attention to negative emotions, they tend to dissipate, but positive ones expand.
So instead of trying to ignore that feeling of anxiety that makes me want to check my phone, I should just sit with it and observe it.
Exactly. And Eyal gives 4 steps for reimagining an internal trigger.
Okay, what are they?
First, you need to pay attention to what you're feeling right before you get distracted.
So what's the emotion that's driving that urge?
Exactly. Second, write down what that internal trigger is so you can start to become more aware of it. Third, explore the sensation with curiosity. Don't judge yourself, just notice what's happening in your body and your mind. And fourth, be extra careful during those liminal moments.
Liminal moments.
Yeah, those are those in-between times when our focus is more likely to waver, like when you're finishing one task and about to start another,
Okay.
or when you're transitioning from work to home.
Got it.
Okay, so that's how we can start to master those internal triggers.
So what about those external triggers? The notifications and the emails and all that stuff. How do we deal with those?
So this is where Eyal talks about hacking back external triggers. And the first step is to ask yourself this question. Is this trigger serving me or am I serving it?
Is this trigger serving me or am I serving it?
Yeah. Every time you get a notification or an email or whatever, ask yourself, is this actually helping me achieve my goals, or is it just pulling me away from what I'm trying to do?
Right, because a lot of times those notifications are just distractions.
Exactly. And Eyal gives this example of a woman named Wendy who was trying to finish this really important proposal for work, but she kept getting distracted by all the notifications on her phone. And she was really frustrated because she felt like she couldn't get anything done. And research actually shows that even just seeing a notification without even responding to it can be distracting.
Really, just seeing it.
Yeah. They call it brain drain because it takes mental effort to resist the urge to check the notification. So even if you just glance at it, it can still take you out of your flow.
That's crazy.
So Eyal gives some examples of how to minimize those interruptions.
Like what?
Well, he talks about how nurses at Kaiser Permanente started wearing these bright-colored vests when they were dispensing medication.
Why?
So that people would know not to interrupt them. Because even a small interruption can lead to a mistake.
Oh, right.
And he compares this to the aviation industry, where pilots aren't allowed to do anything that's not essential when they're below 10,000 feet.
So it's all about setting boundaries and creating these visual cues to signal that you're not available.
Exactly. And then he talks about email, which is like the ultimate source of external triggers for a lot of people.
Oh, yeah.
He says our brains are wired to treat every email like it could be urgent because of the way email works.
Mm-hmm.
You know, sometimes you get a really important email that you need to respond to right away.
Right.
So we're always on edge waiting for that next important email. And he gives some tips for managing email more effectively.
Okay, like what?
Well, first he says you should set aside specific times to check your email instead of constantly checking it throughout the day, like have office hours for email.
Right.
And then he says you should delay sending non-urgent email because if you send an email at like 11 p.m.,
Right.
the other person might feel like they need to respond right away.
Yeah.
And then he says be ruthless about unsubscribing from anything you don't actually read. And use tools like SaneBox, which has this feature called Black Hole.
Black hole? What's that?
It's basically a folder where you can send all the emails that you don't want to see,
Okay.
like newsletters and stuff.
Okay.
And he also recommends processing emails in batches instead of dealing with them one at a time.
Okay.
And he has this system called Play Tag, where you basically only touch each email twice. The first time you read it and decide when you need to respond to it.
Okay.
And then you tag it with today or this week or whatever. And then the second time you touch it is when you actually respond to it.
That's a really good idea.
Yeah, it's really simple but effective. And then, of course, there's group chat.
Oh, don't even get me started on group chat.
I know, right? Eyal quotes Jason Fried, who's the co-founder of Basecamp, and he says that group chat is like an all-day meeting with random participants and no agenda.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's pretty accurate.
So Eyal has 4 rules for managing group chat.
Okay. I'm listening.
First, use it sparingly, like only when it's really necessary.
Yeah.
Second, schedule it.
Schedule it.
Yeah, like set aside specific times to check and respond to messages instead of leaving it open all day. Third, be picky about who you add to group chats, because the more people you have, the more distracting it's going to be.
Right.
And fourth, set clear expectations with your team about when you're available and how quickly you'll respond to messages.
Okay.
And then he talks about meetings, which can also be a huge source of distraction.
Oh, yeah.
He says that people often use their devices during meetings as a way to escape from boredom or tension. So he suggests a few rules for making meetings more productive. First, make it harder to call a meeting in the first place.
Okay.
Like require a clear agenda and some pre-reading materials. Second, focus the meeting on making decisions rather than brainstorming or problem solving.
Right.
Do that stuff beforehand. And third, encourage people to be fully present.
Yeah.
Like maybe only allow one laptop in the room for presenting and taking notes.
Okay, so how do we hack back our phones specifically? Because our phones are like the ultimate distraction devices.
Right. So Eyal gives this 4-step plan. The first step is to remove any apps that you don't actually need, like all those games and social media apps that you just waste time on. The second step is to replace any distracting phone-based apps with their desktop versions. So if you're going to check social media, do it on your computer instead of your phone.
Okay.
And he also recommends getting a wristwatch so you don't have to use your phone to check the time.
Right.
The third step is to rearrange your home screen. Put all the apps that you use for work or productivity on the first screen and hide all the distracting apps in folders or on other screens.
Okay.
And get in the habit of using the search function to find apps instead of scrolling through your screens.
Oh, okay.
And then the fourth step is to reclaim your notification settings. Be really selective about which apps are allowed to send you notifications and make sure you're using Do Not Disturb mode effectively.
Right.
He also talks about how to hack back your desktop environment, like organizing your files and tabs so that they're not visually distracting.
That's a good point. Because clutter can be really overwhelming.
Yeah. There was a study at Princeton that found that clutter actually makes it harder to focus and process information. And then Eyal has this rule that he never reads articles in his web browser.
Really?
Yeah. He saves them to Pocket or Instapaper and reads them later when he has dedicated time for reading.
Oh, okay.
And he also talks about something called multi-channel multitasking, which is basically doing two things at once that use different parts of your brain, like listening to an audiobook while you're exercising or doing chores.
Right, because that's not really multitasking. It's just using your time more efficiently.
Exactly. And then he recommends using browser extensions to block out distracting elements on websites.
Okay.
Like DFTube, which removes all the recommended videos from YouTube, and Newsfeed Burner, which blocks out your newsfeed on Facebook and Twitter. And he says that if you have to use social media, try to go directly to the page or profile you're looking for instead of scrolling through your feed.
Okay.
And he also talks about how some people make these really extreme effort pacts with technology.
Like what?
Well, he talks about the novelist Jonathan Franzen, who disabled the internet on his writing computer so he wouldn't get distracted. And he also talks about how Quentin Tarantino and Jhumpa Lahiri write their first drafts by hand.
Wow.
So the idea behind these effort packs is to make it physically harder to get distracted. And they can be really effective. Like, there are apps like Self-Control and Freedom that let you block certain websites or apps for a set amount of time.
Right.
And then there's Forest, which is an app that lets you plant a virtual tree. And if you leave the app, the tree dies.
Uh-huh. That's a good one. Okay, so we've talked about how to master internal triggers, how to hack back external triggers. So what about those packs? How do we use packs to prevent distraction?
So pacts are basically pre-commitments that we make to ourselves to help us stay on track.
Okay.
And there are three main types of pacts. The first type is called an effort pact. And that's basically what we were just talking about, making it more difficult to do the things that we don't want to do.
Right.
Like using website blockers or app timers. The second type is called a price pact. And that's where you put money on the line.
Okay.
So if you don't stick to your commitment, you lose money. And Nir Eyal talks about this study that was done on smokers.
Okay.
And they found that smokers were way more likely to quit if they had to put down a deposit that they would lose if they started smoking again.
Interesting.
And he also talks about how he used a burn or burn calendar to motivate himself to finish writing Indistractable.
Murder burn.
Yeah. He basically had this calendar where he would mark off each day that he worked on the book.
Okay.
And if he missed a day, he had to burn a $100 bill.
Oh, wow.
But he warns that price packs might not be a good idea for everyone.
Yeah.
Like if you tend to be really hard on yourself, it might just make you feel worse if you fail. And then the third type of pact is an identity pact.
Identity pact.
Yeah. It's about aligning your actions with your identity.
Okay.
So if you want to be an indistractable person, you need to start acting like one. And one way to do this is to publicly announce your commitment.
Okay.
Like tell your friends and family that you're trying to be more focused and intentional with your time.
Right.
Because research shows that when we teach something to others, it actually helps us learn it better ourselves.
Interesting.
And another way to reinforce your identity is to create rituals.
Rituals?
Yeah. Like Nir Eyal talks about how he has a morning ritual where he repeats certain mantras to himself.
Okay.
And he also says that having a regular time-box schedule can be a kind of ritual because it helps you reinforce your identity as someone who is organized and in control of their time.
That's a good point.
So pacts can be really powerful tools for preventing distraction.
Okay, so we've talked about how to master internal triggers, how to hack back external triggers, and how to use packs. But how do we apply all of this to our everyday lives, like in the workplace and in our relationships?
So Eyal dedicates a good chunk of the book to talking about how to create an indistractable workplace and how to be more indistractable in our relationships.
Okay, let's start with the workplace.
So he starts by talking about how dysfunctional work cultures can actually be a major cause of distraction.
Really?
Yeah. He says that when people feel overwhelmed or like they don't have control over their work, they're more likely to turn to distractions as a way to cope.
That makes sense.
And he talks about the importance of psychological safety.
What's that?
It's basically the feeling that you can speak up and share your ideas without fear of judgment. And research has shown that psychological safety is one of the biggest predictors of team success.
Interesting.
And Eyal outlines 3 steps for creating psychological safety.
Okay.
First, framework as a learning problem.
Okay.
Like, encourage people to see mistakes as opportunities for growth. Second, acknowledge fallibility. You know, be open about the fact that everyone makes mistakes.
Right.
And third, make it safe to ask questions. And he gives the example of Slack, which he says is a good example of an indistractable workplace.
Yeah.
Because they have this culture of work hard and go home.
I like that.
Yeah. And their leaders actually model this behavior by scheduling blocks of uninterrupted work time in their own calendars.
So it's not just lip service, they actually do it.
Exactly. And they also use their own technology in ways that promote psychological safety. Like they use emoji reactions to get quick consensus on things so people don't feel like they have to speak up in a meeting if they don't want to.
That's a good idea.
So creating a workplace where people feel safe and supported can go a long way in reducing distraction.
Okay, so what about relationships? Especially with kids these days, all the technology they have access to.
Yeah. So Eyal talks about how a lot of parents are struggling with this.
Definitely.
Because it feels like their kids are always on their phones or tablets or whatever. But he says that we need to be careful about demonizing technology because it's not inherently bad. It's just a tool. And he says that instead of just banning devices, we should focus on teaching our kids how to manage their own distractions. And he talks about this theory called self-determination theory, which says that everyone have 3 basic psychological needs: autonomy, competence, and relatedness.
Okay.
And when these needs aren't met, people are more likely to seek out distractions to fill that void.
Interesting.
And he says that a lot of kids today are lacking in autonomy.
In what way?
Well, they have less free time than previous generations, and their schedules are often packed with activities that are chosen by their parents.
That's true.
And he also talks about the decline of free play, where kids just get to explore and use their imagination without adult supervision.
Right.
And he cites research that shows that this lack of free play might actually be contributing to rising rates of anxiety and depression in kids.
Wow.
So he says that instead of just trying to control our kids' screen time, we should focus on helping them develop those skills of self-regulation and self-determination. And one way to do that is to involve them in the process of creating their own time-boxed schedules.
So they have some say in how they spend their time.
Exactly. And he says that even things like playing video games can be part of a healthy schedule if they're done intentionally and in moderation.
Right.
And he stresses the importance of giving kids autonomy.
So letting them make their own choices even if we don't agree with them.
Yeah, and letting them experience the natural consequences of those choices.
Okay.
And he also talks about how we can help kids manage external triggers, like by teaching them how to customize their notification settings and use Do Not Disturb mode.
Right.
And he uses this analogy of a swimming pool.
The swimming pool.
Yeah. He says that when kids are first learning to swim, we don't just throw them in the deep end.
Right.
We start them off in the shallow end and gradually work our way up. And it's the same thing with technology.
So start them off with limited access and then gradually give them more freedom as they get older and more responsible.
Exactly. And he also emphasizes the importance of respecting kids' time.
So like if they're in the middle of something, don't just interrupt them.
Right. And he says that we should involve them in setting their own screen time limits so that they feel like they have some control over the process. He gives this example of his own daughter who decided that she wanted to limit herself to 2 shows a day.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And it worked because she came up with it herself. And then he talks about the social contagion of distraction.
What's that?
It's basically the idea that when one person pulls out their phone, it can trigger other people to do the same.
Oh, yeah. I've definitely noticed that.
Yeah. And he compares this to smoking. You know how in the past it was totally normal to smoke in public places?
Right.
But then we started to develop social antibodies against smoking. And now it's pretty taboo to smoke in most places. And he says that we need to do the same thing with distraction.
So like create social norms around phone use.
Exactly. Like maybe have a rule that everyone puts their phones in a basket at the beginning of a dinner party.
Yeah, I like that.
And he even gives some scripts for what to say when someone fubs you.
Fubs you?
Yeah. It's like when someone ignores you in favor of their phone.
Oh, okay.
Like you can say, hey, I'm feeling a little ignored right now. Can we put our phones away for a bit?
Right.
And then finally, he talks about how to be an indistractable lover.
Right.
Host speaker.